Huffington Post, the National Security Agency spied on the Vatican and top Catholic cardinals, says an Italian report. Italian magazine reports the National Security Agency spied on internal communications at the Vatican and phone calls at the Domus Sancti, the church residence where the cardinals live during the papal conclave and the Pope's current home. Weekly magazine Panorama reports in an issue that hit the streets on Thursday this week that the NSA labelled calls in and out of the Vatican offices as leadership intentions, threats to the financial system, foreign policy objectives and human rights. It says calls regarding this year's election of the new president of the Vatican Bank, Ernst von Freiberg, were also intercepted. Sounds like the NSA seems to be keeping an eye on just about everyone. But why should they be interested in the papal conclave? Who's going to be Pope?
It's quite obvious why people would be interested, or why they might be interested in these things. They're trying to control the political situation in Italy and elsewhere. And since we're mentioning Italy, let's come back to Italy. The police force in Italy have made it absolutely clear. Imposimato is a senior judge. He was in charge of investigation into the Aldo Moro murder and also into various other assassination attempts and bombings under Operation Gladio in the 1970s and 1980s. They're quite clear that the Western intelligence services, including MI5 and MI6, are terrorists. They do, in fact, foment terrorism of various kinds in order to achieve their political objectives. Now, once the government has become a terrorist government, there are two ways to deal with it. You do it the proper way, through the police force, which means arresting the head of MI5 and MI6 and saying, what are you up to? Or you do it the nasty way, as the IRA used to do. We're going to find them and we're going to blow their brains out. Now, I don't agree with that. I think it should be done by the police. But we need the police, the civilian police force, independent of the government, to look into what's going on here. And if the head of GCHQ has been breaking the law, just like an 18-year-old who steals a bottle of water in a riot, the head of GCHQ must go to prison, because that's the only way to deter them.
And what about all the other spying, the massive telephone trawls, millions of phone calls in France, listened to, spied on. We've also had Angela Merkel's mobile phone tapped. We've also had large numbers of phone calls in Spain also listened to. It does seem that it's almost every week another major area of European life actually is being listened to by this National Security Agency.
The whole Gladio structure created in the 1940s was designed to ensure that Western Europe played its role in a US, British-led power grab across the world. And therefore politicians, they're listening to politicians' phone calls to blackmail them, to second-guess them, to make sure they do as they're told. And of course, if they don't do as they're told, nasty things can happen to them, like Aldo Moro, who was supposedly kidnapped by the Red Brigades, but the Italian police are pretty confident that wasn't the Red Brigades that kidnapped him, it was NATO intelligence.
But could that ever happen at other levels, like, say, for example, at the United Nations level or Britain?
Yes. Now, of course, I presume that the FSB in Russia and the Chinese intelligence services and so on will be very well aware of what the NATO intelligence services have been up to, because they themselves have no rule of law. But I say to those who think that the rule of law doesn't matter, once you've lost the rule of law, there are no rules, and there'll be no crying for mummies. But I suggest that what we need is a rule of law, and that means we've got to go back through what NATO intelligence services have been doing for the last 20, 30 years, and if necessary, go and find previous heads of the intelligence services, like Reinhard Gehlen, who was in fact head of the Gestapo in Eastern Europe and then ended up running the West German intelligence services, cooperating with MI6 and with the CIA to foment terrorism in Germany. If he's still alive, he should go to prison. I don't care if he's 80 or 90. We're still chasing Nazis now, aren't we?
One of the interesting things about the phone hacking trials that's opened this week is that some of the players who work for News International have turned Queen's evidence, haven't they?
Well, that's how you do it. That's how the Italian police finally got to the bottom of what was going on in their country, although they've never been able to successfully prosecute because these people are very, very powerful. Berlusconi has been put in court loads of times, but it's very hard to arrest him because he is in the pocket of the mafia. He is the richest guy in the country. He does control virtually 90% of the media, and the police have been doing their best to catch him, but it's quite hard when he's got very big friends and protectors. And the same would be true of senior people in Britain and the US. Britain and the US, in fact, created Operation Gladio, which was involved in all sorts of skullduggery in Western Europe during the 70s and 80s, the Brabant massacres in Belgium, the Bologna bombing in Italy, the Piazza Fontana bombing in 1969.
But I mean, surely the Chinese and the Soviets and the Russians would do this sort of thing just the same,
They do indeed. I mean, it looks as if the FSB bombed Moscow in 1999 and blamed the Chechens. Just because they do it doesn't mean that we should do it. We're supposed to have better standards than they do. And we're always ticking off President Putin for being not a proper Democrat, although he's got far better electoral prospects than many of our leaders. Basically, I would suggest that nobody should be engaging in illegal wiretapping, nor should intelligence services be fomenting terrorism. And if they are, the civilian police force, the model here is the police service of Northern Ireland, should arrest them and make sure they pay the price.
But there's no real prospect of that, is there?
Oh, I suggest that there is. I suggest that's exactly where we've got to go. The population has to wake up, realise that the intelligence services are way out of control. They're in the pockets of the military-industrial complex and the criminal bankers. And all of these people, the vulnerability they've got is that they are all breaking the law. Now, they've got away with it for many years and they've become very rich by doing it. But the fact is, they have all been breaking the law and therefore they are vulnerable, just like the little lad who stole that bottle of water. And we can get them, and we will.
Driving home with BCFM 93.2, the station you can count on.
Well, there's plenty of paranoia being spread by the mainstream press about Iran and Syria, but what about the US Secretary of State, who's a member of something called the Brotherhood of Death? A British professor now gives us the unedited lowdown. That's Professor Anthony Sutton, and this interview was recorded back in 1980. So he looks at the organisation, the Skull and Bones Society, of which John Kerry, who's now US Secretary of State, is a member.
Please tell us about the order and how you came to discover it exists.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. The order is truly a secret society. It was founded in the United States at Yale University in 1833. It has continued and exists down to the present day. Each year, the order takes in 15 men, senior students from Yale University. Never more than 15, only once has it been less than 15. In 1946, they took in, I think, 10 rather than 15 members. So what we have is a secret society which, over the last 150 years, has accumulated about 2,500 members, of whom perhaps 500 are alive today. Of this 500, perhaps 100 are actively in pursuit of the objectives of the order. It's not another college fraternal society. Yale University is the only university in the United States, or indeed the world, which has senior societies. These are societies where the 15 are selected in the junior year and actually are initiated at the beginning of the senior year. They stay on campus only 1 year as members. They are called knights. When they graduate, they leave the university, they go out into the world, then they're known as patriarchs. So at any one time, you only have 15 knights in existence, and for the rest of their lives, they're known as patriarchs. And they work during their lifetime, or a number do, towards the ends of the order. They are pretty much guaranteed success. Certainly they're guaranteed financial success. And in my reading of the material I have, I infer that so long as they go along with the purposes of the order, so long as they gear their careers and their lives towards certain ends, then they are guaranteed success. How did I come to this knowledge? Well, up to 6 months ago, I denied that there was a conspiracy, because, frankly, I couldn't prove one. I suspected a conspiracy, but I couldn't prove there was one until 6 months ago. Well, a little before 6 months ago, I received the catalog, which is the membership list of the society, all the way back to 1833. And I received some of their internal documents, enough for me to put together the way they correspond with each other, the operations within the order, to some extent their problems, and to some extent their objectives.
Now, this is the book, An Introduction to the Order, by Anthony C. Sutton. It has a skull and bones on the front and 322.
The 322 is an identification. The order has a temple on the Yale campus.
A temple?
A temple, yes. It's a building maybe this 50, 60 feet by 40 feet, maybe 40 feet high. There's no windows, two big steel doors. We know what the temple looks like because back in 1880s, a number of Yale students became a little unhappy about what was going on inside this temple. When they went by it at midnight, sometimes they heard strange noises and all kinds of rumors on the Yale campus as to what this might be. There was a break-in. I call it the Yale Gate. There was a break-in to the temple, and the students who broke in cataloged what they found, and they made a drawing, a design of the interior of the temple. And three of the rooms are numbered. One is 322, one is 323, and one is 324. 322 is also, I suspect, the chapter number. And also in correspondence between members, they conclude their correspondence where you and I would conclude yours truly or yours sincerely. They conclude yours in 322. Why 322? There are several theories for this. One is that the order originated with Demosthenes, the Greek, in 322 BC. That's one theory. Another one is that it stems from the founding date in the United States, which was 1832. So really we have the last two numbers, 32, the second chapter, founded in 1832. The skull and crossbones are prominent in their ceremonies, initiation ceremonies.
This is a symbol of death. Now, why would they take a symbol of death?
Yes, from what I understand, when a new member is initiated, that would be in the senior year at Yale, he's placed within a coffin.
Oh, my.
And now we only know this from the Yale Gate papers. These, I call it Yale Gate. And from the photographs we have of members inside the temple, many of these photographs are the 15 sitting around a table, and they have this skull and the crossbones sitting on the table in front of them. It is the symbol of death, and it has been called the Brotherhood of Death, and I think it probably more adequately should be called the Brotherhood of Death. So what I've had to do is look at the history, the biographies of the leading members of the order, and reconstruct their career, and see if there's a common pattern in their careers. While doing that, I came across some interesting documents. Some members apparently are not too happy once they become involved with this after 10 or 20 years. One member in particular left a memorandum. He wrote it in 1932. It was buried away in his papers. I don't think anybody found it before I did. And it was a 6-page memorandum on the order, naming some of the members, and said it was the most sordid thing ever happened in the history of man. So, but to come back to my point, I have to reconstruct the objectives. What are the objectives? In the words of one member, might is right. If you have the power, you use it to achieve your objectives. What is the objective? As you look at the histories of individual members, it can only be one thing: to acquire power, to keep power, to use power for their own purposes.
Martin, to acquire power, to keep power, and to use power for their own purposes. This is John Kerry, who's US Secretary of State in charge of the biggest nuclear arsenal on planet Earth.
Yes, and coming back to what we were talking about before that clip, the ruling class is literally criminal. And I don't use that as a sort of political rhetoric, oh, they're criminals because they're not very nice. I mean, they are literally criminal. A lot of what they've been doing, Skull and Bones is just a part of the picture, is in fact criminal. And there's a complete interface between the politicians, the intelligence services, and the financial criminals. And in actual fact, it's not that difficult for police services which were determined to work out what's going on, if they were prepared to do so. Now,
as a member of Skull and Bones, John Kerry swears oaths to loyalty to the club, and to his fellow members, not to the rest of us. And several times on US television, he's been questioned by interviewers about the club. He refuses to say anything about it. He says basically it's a secret.
Yes, and I think that's all very well, and people shouldn't have voted for him. But when he stood for president against Bush, basically...
He's from the Democratic Party.
He's a Democrat, yeah. He basically won, but he threw the fight. He should have said, look, you're cheating, you're using electronic hacking on the voting machines in Ohio, which is a swing state. The Republican, the representative John Conyers and JFK Jr. were looking into this, although JFK Jr. then had a mysterious plane crash, as people do in the United States. I think that what we're dealing with here is the routinization of criminal behaviour by senior elites on both sides of the Atlantic. And that seems to be very unpleasant and difficult to deal with. But I would say the Achilles heel of all of this is that virtually everything they are doing is illegal under existing law, and that they are therefore completely vulnerable to police investigation. Now, the police, if any police officers are listening to this, it is your job to get stuck in and arrest these people on behalf of the rest of the community. That's what you're paid for.
What about in the United States, though? I mean, surely some of the senior police officers are also part of this skull and bone society.
Well, in that case, other police officers who aren't, it's their job to deal with that, isn't it?
But how do they do that if actually being a member of this society is not a crime?
No, but I wouldn't arrest people for being part of Skull and Bones. That is just where the high-level deals are done. But the deals are that we will cheat in elections, for example, and we will cover it up. That's the deal. That's the sort of thing.
These are actually quite serious criminal offences, aren't they? Misconduct in public office, malfeasance. You can go to jail for life for these things.
Well, in Britain, we've only got the death penalty is still on the statute book for one crime: treason. And if we find, for example,
I think you'll find actually under the Labour government they got rid of that.
All right, well, I'm not in favour of death penalties anyway for this, because if you arrest people for being involved in high-level corruption, fraud, and promotion of terrorism, you don't want to kill them. You want to keep them in prison for life.
It's a bit like
so keep going back to them. And,
the Saddam and the Gaddafi syndrome, where actually, if they'd have been kept alive, they would have had all sorts of information on corrupt Western officials.
If they'd been put on trial at the International Criminal Court, their defence lawyers would have said, right, call the senior Western politicians that we used to deal with. Let's have a chat. And this, of course, is why these guys have to die. But that's not rule of law. That's gangsterism.
How have we ended up, though, with somebody who's a member of this society, the Brotherhood of Death, in charge of all these nuclear weapons?
Well, because the Skull and Bones Society is right at the heart of the US establishment and has been for a couple of centuries. And if you want to get anywhere in US politics, which means you go to Yale and Harvard...
But we've had plenty of presidents who aren't part of this society in the past, haven't we?
Well, most of them have in recent years.
I think since the War on Terror they have.
Well, yes, I mean, that's the whole point, is that they've gradually removed everybody else from
the scene. Obama isn't, is he?
Well, we're not sure about it.
No, we don't think he is as part of this society. I mean, certainly George Bush and John Kerry were.
Bush and Kerry certainly so, yeah.
But so Obama, surely, he's an independent, free-minded guy, isn't he?
Well, I mean, the jury's out on who pulls his strings, but the reality is that the political elites in the West have basically embraced criminal behaviour as part of their normal activities. And of course the politicians aren't necessarily always cut in on what's going on. They are essentially PR people, and they are told what to say by the people who are really pulling the strings, who tend to be the money people in alliance with the military industrial complex, the sort of the generals, the CIA and the financial people. But they are criminals, there's no doubt about it, and plenty of police officers who at the senior level know exactly what I'm talking about.
Driving home with BCFM 93.2, the station you can count on.